Every now and then we'll run into a problem whenever we're working on a vehicle when we do everything just like we should have done it, but it blows up in our face anyway. Sometimes we can be our own worst enemy, and we can make some silly mistakes because we didn't keep track of something. I've actually seen stuff go down through an injector hole, get only on top of a valve, and then drop into a cylinder, because it was something that just got away. I always like to blow the top of the engine off before I pull injectors out, or before I pull the spark plugs out of something like any of these that got spark plug wells on the top as a V engine, like a Crown Victoria or something like that. Because if something falls down in there next to the spark plug hole, and then somebody puts a socket down in there and rams it and crams it where you can't even blow it out with air, you got an issue. If it's not something magnetic, you can fish out there with a magnet. But it's a good idea to blow the top off of it, before you pull the intake or before you do anything where intrusive material ought to get down in there. But every now and then something will happen that just blows up in your face, and that leaves you wondering how you could have dodged this. And unless somebody's been there, they don't really think a lot about it. Okay. These Volkswagen diesel Rabbits that I worked on when I was at the dealership for a long time had these valve adjustment procedures that we would do. We did it so regularly, it was just a standard procedure to do that with, you'd have the lobes up on the valves, and you would have a go-no-go feeler gauge for your exhaust and your intake. And then you would use those little shims that the parts manager had a whole pack of them, a whole big tray of those shims that we could use, and they were all lined up in order so that which one you needed to go, and you'd measure it, and then you'd pull the shim out, and you'd either mic it with a micrometer. Most of the time it would have numbers on it so that you could tell how thick the shim was, and you could add one a little thicker if there was too much clearance, or a little thinner if there wasn't enough clearance, and that kind of thing. And I had done a lot of these things. A lot of them, and they were just routine. We only charged $18 to do a valve adjustment and replace the intake gasket. Now this was in 1983, so that was back in those days. The prices weren't where they are now. It was a pretty good bit of job. You see the tools there behind me pictured, and basically what you would do nowadays on the Toyotas, a lot of your Toyotas, they don't have shims. The little cam followers are actually different. The little bump on the underside of the cam follower, they're different thicknesses, and you're supposed to measure them and then pull the cam shafts out and replace the cam followers with the white ones based on the figures that you wrote down. And if you ever have to pull all of those cam followers out of there to replace valve stem seals or something, like I talked about in another video, you need to make sure you keep those cam followers exactly in the order they came out. If you did it exactly the right way, you would measure the clearances on all those darn things before you pulled them out, and then you would get the right ones to put the clearances exactly right. To be perfectly honest, the clearance is not that terribly critical on these. I have never seen it. They don't make a lot of noise. I haven't seen it run a lot different. But I ran into an issue on this one routine job that came in that didn't amount to, I was just like, oh, I've done so many of these, it's going to be a simple thing, And so what we would do, there's how the shim fit into the top of the little carrier. You see the little dotted line I drew for the valve stem that was up underneath it. And that little carrier rides up and down in this thing right here, right? And this is what it looked like. You see the little notches here? And what you would do is you'd use those little pliers that I showed earlier. Right here, the pliers you would pull the shim out with, but you'd use this tool to go between there and push down on that little edge part and get it cleared where you could get those shims out of there. They had it fixed where you didn't have to pull. The shim was a better idea than what Toyota has, I think, because you don't have to pull that. The Toyota one looks like that, and then you have to mic it with your little mic and determine what to go. The Toyota, it doesn't look like this, it looks like that. And on the ones with the chains or whatever, you got to pull the camshaft slam out and change it. So there's your cam follower, and this right here's your valve stem. There's your shim, various thicknesses based on what you need. You measure it with the globe up and clearance at maximum. Okay, here's question 1. What's the term that describes the place indicated on this valve opening chart? Just about all of you guys are going to know that. That is a very simple question. I used to ask this question to my students. I'd have just wild card questions like this. And I've got these seeded throughout this little presentation here. All right, these are the tools. Once again, they have one like that, and then they have one like this. That was a different. You can buy both grades of it, and then you reach around the camshaft after you get it. The cam follower is pushed down, and then you can get the little shim out and put a different one in there, and then remeasure it. Is what you have to do. It's always a good idea to do it with the engine cold if you can. But sometimes we do it with the engine warm. It didn't really make that much difference. This is what the engine looked like in there. We have to take this off. There's your injector pump. It's a Bosch injector pump. You might notice all of these hoses, except for the injector lines where the high pressure was, all these hoses were that braided rubber stuff that Volkswagen likes to use. And if you were going to bleed one of these, what you would do is you just pull that line off right there and spin it over until it pumped the fuel out there, and your injector pump was full. They're supposed to have about 25 psi of fuel pressure down in this part of it. But when this thing's spinning over, it actually creates a vacuum that pulls the fuel out of the tank. And so it's a real, that's the way that Bosch like to do stuff. That down there was the vacuum pump like they use for the brake booster. Those diesels don't typically have vacuum. But anyway, that's actually a picture of a diesel Rabbit that I drove, or one like it. Up here was your fuel and water separator, and it basically had a little pump on it so you could fill it up too. Anyway, we would pull this air cleaner off, we'd pull the valve cover off, and then we'd get in there and do our work on doing the valves. This guy right here, when he came back to pick it up, it had cooled completely down. He came to pick it up the next day, and this is about what he reminded me of. Well, the thing about it was I could hear it. It didn't do this whenever I got through with it working on it in there, because it didn't take as long to adjust the valves. And I noticed that when I was doing the valve adjustment on these, they had lots and lots of clearance. I mean, massive amounts of clearance. I've never seen valves with that much clearance, and I had to put really thick shims in there to bring them within spec. Well, when I got through, I cranked it up, and it ran just fine. I didn't find any oil leaks, so I pulled it outside. Well, the guy came to pick it up the next day. Those cam followers were going deeper into their holes where the varnish was, and they were sticking on that varnish, and then the piston would bump the valve and it would, make it shut. And so it was making a clinkety, clinkety, clink noise until it started up. And after it warmed up, it didn't do it. Boy, that guy threw a screaming fit. And here I was, I said, well, I didn't do anything I shouldn't have done, although this was a sign of an unusual situation. He didn't have a problem, he just wanted the valves adjusted, see. And so it wasn't running bad. He had no issue we were trying to straighten out. Anyway, so he comes in, and so I got options here. I can fix it for free by pulling the camshaft and pulling all the cam followers out and cleaning all of that varnish out around down in there, which was going to be a whole lot of free labor, because that guy wasn't going to pay anybody to do that, because in his mind it wasn't his fault, although the car developed that problem for whatever reason. I could put the valves back where they were. That's what I chose to do. I decided, well, I'm just going to put the valves back with the same clearance they had before I started working on it. And so I put them all back, and I steam cleaned the guy's engine and made it look real pretty and all. And, we let him out of there. I don't even think the service manager charged him anything, but I ain't getting paid any labor on it either. But it was one of those things that blows up in your face. He didn't see that coming. Don't know, what in the world. Why in the world that happened like it did. But one way or another, that's the only time I remember into that, and I did lots and lots of valve adjustments while I was there. So what happens here? This is a true story. This really happened to me. Service provider brought a customer to talk to me about a problem he's having with his truck. I had not seen this man's truck. I had not worked on it. I'd never seen him before. And he came out there, and he says, what do you think might be causing fuel? It was a Ford pickup, to transfer from one of my tanks to the other. Even though I hadn't switched tanks, it's transferring fuel from one tank to the other. And how you just speak off the top of your head. I knew what was wrong with it, but I said, well, if I was just going to take a guess at it, I would replace that fuel tank switching valve because that diaphragm ruptures in there, or something goes wrong inside of it and it causes it. That's really all it could be. And so he says, and I was trying to work on an instrument cluster while he was standing on the passenger side with a service writer. And he says, "Will you SOB," except he said the words, he said, "I'm not going to let you experiment on my truck." And I just looked at the service writer and I said, "Get this guy out of here." I said, "I don't need to talk to him anymore." And the service writer took that guy up to the front and told him to go get his truck worked on somewhere else because we weren't going to work on it. But he was an absolute jerk. Can you imagine how ugly he would have been if I had done something and it didn't quite turn out right? So I was just really kind of glad that we ran him off. When my dad was running his shop in the 1960s, he made a remark when he worked on a Corvair, that's my dad there, that he had to do it with the shop doors closed. When asked why, he said, if somebody sees you working on a Corvair, they'll bring you another one. A lot of you might be somewhat familiar with Corvair. That engine turns backwards. And you can take a Volkswagen transaxle and put the ring gear on the other side of the pinion, which is something you can do in a Volkswagen Bug transaxle. And then you could put a Corvair engine in a Volkswagen. Of course, you had to cut all the fenders out and everything. And boy, you could have you a hoss then. That's an air-cooled 6. But it turns the opposite direction. In other words, a Bug engine, when you're looking at the engine from the back of the car, it turns clockwise. This one here turns counterclockwise, which is a screwball. Now, front-wheel drive vehicles have engines that turn the opposite way if the engine's in there backwards. The engine's always going to turn the way that the car rolls. So if you got a Mitsubishi or a Honda Civic or something like that, the timing belt's on the driver's inside of the engine, it's going to turn, backwards to the engine that's facing the other way. Just remember that. Well, some cars we just don't like. The 93 Ford Probe, this one here had a lot of miles on it, 2.5 liter engine and all that. AC didn't work, the battery light was on. The guy brought it in for that. All right, by the way, here's a little bit of a blurb. Did you know the Ford Probe was they almost replaced the Mustang with the Ford Probe in 1989. Can you imagine what a horror story that would have been? There was so much backlash from customers that Ford decided to come off of that and keep building the Mustang. And now, even though Ford's gone to building trucks and SUVs, just about everything else, the Mustang is the one car they've held on to because it's such a hot seller. Incidentally, the Ford Mustang is the most recognized car on the planet. You can go to any continent except Antarctica, and if somebody sees a Mustang, if they pay any attention to cars at all, they'll know that's a Mustang. But anyway, you come in for a repair order, it's really tough. It's a true story. It's a job you don't want to do because not because it doesn't pay well, because it's a tough job. What should you do? Complain to the service manager, go home for the day, man up, do the job, and beat book time, or tell the customer their car is a piece of junk? I was working at that same dealer where I ran into the problem with the valves, and one of these 72 or 3 model Volkswagen buses came in that had that Porsche engine in it, and the guy they gave the job to had been working there a long time. And I heard him yelling at the service manager saying, "You said you were going to give the next one of these to somebody else because it needed a crankshaft seal put in it, which means you got to pull a motor out, which is a big job on one of those. Wasn't as easy as the older model 71 in back basically had the Bug engine in the van." And so he screamed and hollered and threw a fit, and he's got his car and went home. And so the service manager gave the job to me, and I pulled it out and put a crankshaft seal in it. The right way to do is just man up and do the job. Well, this one here, he brought his probe to us with an inoperative AC and a dead charging system, both concerns that happened simultaneously. He just noticed it one morning when he was getting ready to leave, and he heard something hit the pavement. And so when he looked under there, he sees this laying there. And you see that rubber from that balancer, the way it's got this pulley around it? It had separated, and it had dropped that part of the balancer off, and the belt was thrown off. Now, there was 2 belts on it. The other belt was still doing just fine, the one for the alternator and the AC. But that particular one, the one for the alternator and the AC was the one that came off. The other one, which pulled the other accessories, was the inside belt. It was still working just fine. All right, so when you're faced with several simultaneous component failures on a vehicle, you should do what? Replace all the components and close the ticket, try to find out what killed them, talk to the service advisor or customer and attempt to determine if all the failures happen at once, or B and C. I'll do the B and C thing on that, because sometimes customers will let the problems pile up, and they'll notice problem A, problem B, problem C, and problem D, and they probably stacked up on them over a period of time until they decided they need to go ahead and get all that fixed. Now, if you take the job in and you're thinking that they may have all failed at one time, if they do say, no, this all started happening at once, and they know what they're talking about, some customers are not, they don't communicate that well, or in a lot of times. But anyway, if they all failed at once, you better find out what's going on there. Now, one time, I worked on a Thunderbird that was a, I don't know, one of them older Thunderbirds, like a 94 model or whatever it was. This thing was one of the ones that had the V6 in it, 3.8. Had that little throttle body on it. Had an idle tracking switch in that idle speed control motor, that little motor went out. And it had one of those black square EVP sensors on it that used to make them stall. You know, I don't know what they did to change the programming, but when that square EVP sensor was first put on there in the early 80s, this was an 84 model, by the way, not a 94. If I said 94 earlier, I'm sorry. But anyway, we would just, if we saw that square thing on there, we would pop one of the round ones on there because they didn't do what the square one did. But that thing could cause the car to stall. The idle tracking switch not being good could cause, you know, having resistance could cause the car. And the throttle position sensor, I got codes for all this stuff. And I wound up needing like 4 repairs because this is the thing. If the car is stalling, and you only fix one of the things that could make it stall, and obviously there's other things that could make it stall, then you're going to get a comeback and you're going to wind up doing it for free. So I just went in and priced out all the parts. Now, they had gone down to the mall, they weren't there. And so it was going to be like $450 parts and labor. And this was way back when, I mean, by golly, it was back in 1989 or 88 or something. And I said, and this big old guy, a big muscled up blonde-haired guy that was a salesman, looked like a wrestler from World Wrestling Federation or something. Anyway, he came out there and he goes, these people are not going to be happy with this estimate you've given. Can't you just replace one of those parts and fix this car? And he says, of course, you couldn't explain anything to him. He says, I've sold these people 5 cars, and they're going to be really upset if they say a $450 estimate on this car. And I said, well, Brian, since you sold them so many cars and you've made so much money off of them, maybe you could help them with their bill. And he goes, just say you're funny. Anyway, they came back up here and I fixed the car. They paid the bill and they drove it away happy, and I never had a complaint out of them again. But see, the guy didn't understand it. He had the idea that I was just throwing parts at it. But every one of those parts needed to be replaced. So the thing hadn't hardly had the hood open on it for 140,000 miles. It was time to do some work on it, you know. Anyway, installing the new balancer would be a simple repair. The replacement balancer was $130. It took some gymnastics with the puller to negotiate the space between the balancer and vehicle frame, but we got it off of there. Okay, so there's a picture of the new balancer right there. So I inspected the part of the timing belt that was visible because I was kind of concerned about that. The timing belt was brand new. I slid the new pulley on the end of the crank, applied the necessary torque to overcome the interference fit, seated the gear, and pinched it against the crankshaft boss, which is really important, and this is why. Let's just stop for another question. If the outer part of a harmonic balancer slips, A, the timing marks may not be dependable, B, the crank sensor might be damaged, C, the belt might wear unevenly. Any of the above can happen. Incidentally, the answer to that first question was overlap. I didn't give you the answer, I just gave you the question. But this is why it's important, and I drew this. That boss has got to be, that crank gear has got to be pinched between the crankshaft boss and that balancer, and it's got to be pinched really hard, because if that pinching between that boss and what that, you know, this key locates it and gives it its proper indexing, but if you let that key be the only thing that's keeping this thing, you know, lined up, whenever all that pulling, that crankshaft is pulling them timing belts, it will eventually shear that key, and then the crankshaft will get ahead of the camshaft. You know, that's one of the things that a lot of people don't think about. If somebody's working on a car at home, a lot of the times they'll just pull it tight until they feel like the belts are lined up, and they won't even think about the fact that this needs to pinch that gear so that it doesn't shear that key. Look at this. I saw this happen on a Bronco. This Bronco had sheared, see where the key was? See that thing came in with low engine vacuum. And it was a one of the old ones had a map sensor on it. It was like a late 80s Bronco with a 302 in it. And the engine vacuum was low, but the timing was right. The balancer hadn't slipped. And so we kept looking around there. Finally, whenever he pulled the front off there, he could see that the camshaft, the late cam timing, will cause it to have low vacuum, and that's what was going on here, because the crankshaft had got ahead of itself. You know, the crankshaft turns that way, and then it basically sheared that, and this gear was running behind because of the keyway. Anyway, that happened because somebody didn't tighten the balancer all the way up. That's just part of it. Well, the new belts were put on and tightened, the splash shield and the tire were installed, the probe was ready to push some wind. Fired it up, backed it out of the shop, it ran really good. You know, why test drive it? All we did was replace the balancer. The next day, when the customer started it up and drove away, he didn't go 300 feet before the engine died. This was another landmine. All right? So this is a funny little thing I found somewhere. Every time I put that on there on Facebook, it gets laughed at. When a failure occurs right after you worked on a customer's vehicle, you should A, get mad, B, tell the customer it wasn't your fault, find out what happened, and be honest. If you were at fault, lie about it. Well, find out what happened. Let's just look at it and see what happened. So it acted like it wanted to start, but it wouldn't. And it deteriorated to the point it was backfiring through the intake and puffing smoke through a crack we found in this that we had missed earlier. So we'd have to have that $100 part when all this was over with because of the mass airflow. Anyway, but this was the first time we worked on Joe's car, and it shook him up. Well, what caused it to happen? Fuel pressure was 40 pounds. Fuel quality and spark were okay. We checked those things. Why was it firing like it had crossed a couple of plug wires? We hadn't done anything to the ignition system. Crank sensor wire rubbing on the pulley, we checked that. That wasn't what it was. You know, sometimes people don't wear out that right, it'll rub. Alright, so induction backfire, this is question 7, is always caused by A, cross plug wires, B, cam timing, C, lean misfires, or D, none of the above. Always is a killer when you're reading a question, okay? Alright, so was it in time? The timing mark was lined up perfectly here on the crankshaft and on the camshaft. We lined that sucker up and it was just like it was supposed to be as far as those marks went. So doggone it. Since the crank pulley mark and the cam gear marks were lined up, the engine was obviously on TDC compression, number one. But what about the distributor? If it was firing out of time, there was something going on in that area. Well, what the deal is? So the distributor is driven by the exhaust camshaft on the front head, so why not remove the distributor cap and see where the rotor was pointing? If you don't have a cylinder hone and you do engine work, you should do what? Find somebody that'll loan you a hone, use sandpaper, don't worry about honing the cylinder, or buy a good hone. There was this guy named Donnie Smith that came over there one day rooting around this other mechanic's toolbox. I may have told this story. It just tickles me every time I think about it. He talked like a hillbilly and had a big old beard on his face. And he came over, he's rooting around in Phillips' toolbox. And I said, what are you in Phillips' toolbox for? I'm looking for a cylinder hone, he said. And I said, well, what happened to your cylinder hone? You're an engine mechanic. He goes, my brother borrowed my cylinder hone. He didn't give it back. I said, well, why don't you get your brother by the beard and jerk him around? He goes, how'd you know my brother had a beard? I couldn't imagine his brother not having a beard, really, but anyway. So with the cap off and the position of the number 1 firing post noted and marked on the distributor housing, we found the rotor was pointing at number 6. We had found something here. This was our problem. But why was it like this and how did it happen? With the rotor pointing at 6, and this one turns counterclockwise when you see it from this angle, what might have caused this issue? The gear marks were lined up, but the camshafts were out of time. Only one thing I could think of that would cause this. You know, you got that little knock pin in there. The cam gear bolt was loose, and the engine died when that gear spun ahead and left its shaft and distributor behind, and the crossfire and ignition and engine stalled. And our impact engine loosened the crank bolt, loosened that cam bolt when we were impact wrenching that thing in. Don't know. Well, on an inline 4-cylinder engine, you could find number 4 top dead center exhaust by doing what? Lining up the timing marks, finding compression on number 2, finding valve overlap on 1, or none of the above. Basically, if you line the timing marks up on a 4-cylinder, you'll typically find TDC exhaust stroke because number 1 will be at compression and that means number 4 is at exhaust because it's a companion. Anyway, the knock pin is here, and that knock pin was gone. I mean, it wasn't sheared off. It just wasn't there anymore. And so I said, well, doggone it, here's the problem. You know, this thing was out of line. So somebody just lined the slot up with where the pin should have been and tightened the crap out of the bolt, apparently, and it worked loose. Well, the four-banging little brother of this V6 uses the bolts to keep the camshaft and the gears married. It doesn't have any knock pins or anything. And you're supposed to just line the camshafts up like this, and some of you guys have done that. Tighten those really good, and then you're good. So I said, you know, if we could get this in the right place, we could tighten that up really tight, and it should be okay because it was before. So we opted to find the sweet spot on the cam boss where the gear needed to be and let the torque of the bolt hold the gear the way it does on a 4-liter single overhead cam Explorer and a 4-cylinder Z-Tech. Now, how do we find the sweet spot without tearing everything down? I used an old Jeep 4-liter rotor alignment trick to decide where the camshaft would be in relation to the gear. Best kind of job is one where you earn your money with your sparks and your skills. That's the best kind of money you got. Alright, so the crank and cam timing marks in place and the distributor installed. I used the Sharpie mark we originally made on the distributor housing, the reference number 1 firing post, set the camshaft so the distributor rotor was just passing the number 1 firing post. Because when it's firing, whenever the timing's advancing and all that, you want it to be advancing on both sides of it. If you lined it straight up, there would be times whenever the timing would, when the timing was advancing, it would jump back and hit the wrong post. That'll cause it to surge going down the road. This is kind of what it looks like over there. You would turn the distributor on the old Jeep so that this was just passing that post with the timing marks lined up in an OTDC compression. The trick worked really good. We torqued the camshaft bolt to 100 foot-pounds, slid the valve cover back on it, and it ran smooth and quiet. It was one of those moments when I heard it fire up and purr. We set the timing, tightened the distributor, installed the covers, belt, splash shield. I installed the new air inlet hose and put one more circumstantial landmine behind us. That means Joe was good to go. Well, anybody that's had any kind of experience working on vehicles has seen jobs that went south when you did everything to cause them to go north. In other words, you wanted them to go smooth and by the numbers, and you got really shocked, you know, and I've had this happen to me a few times. You're trying to do the best job you know how. You're not shortcutting anything. You know, you're trying to make sure that the customer doesn't have any trouble, that they're happy with their work and all that kind of thing. And so that's just some of the perils, you know, of this line of work. At any rate, I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you got something out of it. And hopefully I'll have another story to tell you next week. Until then, I'll see you later.